Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Olivier Thériault, as Professor Rood said. So today I will not necessarily be talking about solar cells and the efficiency or anything like that. I decided to do something different for once. So I decided to talk about a new experimental method that we started using in our lab and why is it useful. So the talk is going to be divided in three important parts. I will first of all describe the solar cells we're using in our lab and measuring in a daily basis, and why is it important to do that measurement. And then I will describe the method that we're implementing. So what we're doing is we're measuring the thickness of these solar cells by using the Fourier transform of the reflectivity. Then I will show you a few experimental measurements to actually prove and show that it's useful and that I'm capable of using it. So first off, the multi-junction solar cells. So what are these solar cells? So as probably most of you already know, these multi-junction solar cells currently have the record efficiency. These are now reached more than 44% under concentration. These are commonly grown in MOCVD reactor, although some university research group are doing it in MB or CB, as done in Sherbrooke, actually. But commonly, companies do that in MOCVD. And the reason why these are so efficient is because these are triple junction cell and they absorb different part of the solar spectrum more efficiently than a single junction cell. So say, for example, a standard design of a multi-junction solar cell has three subcells, one that would be germanium in red, gallium arsenide in green, and indium gallium phosphide in blue. And each of them will absorb a different part of the solar spectrum here. Because they are connected in series, their voltages are added together, and the total current of the cell is actually limited by the limiting subcell. So there's a lot of designs that needs to be done in these solar cells to be capable of improving the efficiency. So because this is a triple junction solar cell, there's so many layers of semiconductor in it. And this means that this is a very, very complex design. The design changes between different companies or between different universities, so it changes a lot depending on the people that are actually doing the growth. So because this is such a complex design, simulating the solar cell is a very, very hard endeavor. It's very complex, and we actually don't really know what are the actual layers of semiconductor inside the solar cells. So a big driving factor for this study of trying to measure the thicknesses of the solar cell was this. We had people in the lab that were trying to simulate these solar cells, but were more or less not entirely sure of the thicknesses that were actually in our solar cell. So to help these people, I decided to try and measure the thicknesses of the semiconductor of the solar cells. So here's more or less the motivation of the talk. We want to measure the thicknesses of all of the layers inside this complex design without actually destroying them. So how will we do that? Well, this is the next part of the talk, the second part. So the Fourier transform of the reflectivity. So a common measurement that we do in our lab is the external quantum efficiency, as seen in the left-hand side graph here. The external quantum efficiency is more or less a proportion of the electron out for the number of photons in. So this is an example of an EQE of a multi-junction cell. So you have the bottom subcell, the middle subcell, and the top subcell. And commonly, with the external quantum efficiency, we actually measure the reflectivity at the same time. And here's an example of the reflectivity of the cell right here, where you see the reflectivity here of the cell with different parts in the reflectivity. So it's a very complex structure in the reflectivity, and there's multiple parts that are very interesting. One very important part for this talk is the fact that in the reflectivity, there's oscillations in different parts of the solar cell. And these oscillations are what we're going to use to actually estimate the thickness inside your solar cell. So some of you might have already seen this type of graph of reflectivity in another type of community, in the thin film community. So this technique has already been used to maybe a small extent, in the thin film technology, using Michelson interferometer, measuring fringes in the reflectivity and deducing the refractive index. So we'll try to use that technique, but for our own purpose, the semiconductors. So why do we have these oscillations in the reflectivity? So here's a 3D graph of the refractive index inside your solar cell. This is in 3 dimensions, so it's maybe a little hard to see because there's a wavelength dependence of it. So we'll pick a single wavelength, say infrared, 1200 nanometer. So inside your solar cell, the refractive index changes drastically depending on which subcell you are inside. And these drastic changes in the refractive index, they create what we call optical cavities, where the light can enter the solar cell and then gets reflected at these drastic change in the refractive index. And these optical cavities, they create interference effect. So whereas the reflected light will either constructively or destructively interfere with the incoming light. So these destructive and constructive interference will create these oscillations depending on the wavelength of your reflectivity. So let's pick a super simple example first. Let's pick a gallium arsenide layer on top of germanium that's non-absorbing and 2 micron thick. So you will get a calculated reflectivity that will look like that, extremely oscillating depending on the wavelength that you get. If you do the Fourier transform of that particular reflectivity, well, you get the exact thickness that you wanted, 2 micron in our case. So this is a very simple example. We'll make it more complex as we go forward. So now let's make it absorbing and wavelength dependent. So to do that, to be capable of doing that, we will solve Maxwell's equation and use the transfer matrix method to calculate the light propagation inside of your semiconductor. So this takes into account the reflection at each of the layers and the transmission as well. So the reflectivity changes, but still looks relatively the same in the infrared region. So you still see this oscillation part. And again, if we do the Fourier transform of this oscillation part, you do get the right thickness. So this is a very strong method that will allow us to obtain the thicknesses inside of our solar cell. So this is what we will try. Beforehand, let's ask ourselves a question. Why not just try to fit the complex reflectivity here? So here's a reflectivity, what I call a calculated reflectivity. I just fed into the transfer matrix method the full structure that we estimated in our lab. So why can't we just fit this reflectivity? Well, I mean, it would probably mean that we would try to fit, I usually call that fitting an elephant to the data. There are so many layers in it. Say, for example, if we remove just a super small layer, here in this example, the tunnel junction, this changes drastically the reflectivity. So because there are so many layers and so many parameters, this means that there would be a lot of different possible solutions for the reflectivity. So you cannot fit the reflectivity. You need other ways to estimate that. That's why we're using this Fourier transform. So let's apply this method, the Fourier transform of the reflectivity, to experimental measurement. So first off, we will look at single junction cell because these are simple. These come from the Sherbrooke University, grown by GNZ. So these are single junction gallium arsenide with a front surface field. And in these, we create an optical cavity by the cap layer, the gallium arsenide here. So we measure the reflectivity of multiple cells here, and then again we do the Fourier transform, and we obtain the thickness of the cap layer, which is here 220 nanometer. This was slightly different than what the person who grew the cell was. She told me that it was 200 nanometer. But because of the uncertainty on the cap layer growth, this is normal. So using that 220 nanometer, you can feed that back into the reflectivity, and you see that the simulated now matches extremely well the experimental measurement. So we can say that we measured accurately the semiconductor thickness. Let's apply that now to a more complex system, the one that we wanted to do at the first time, the multi-junction solar cell reflectivity. So let's see, the oscillating part here in the the green region, are due to the semiconductor on top of it, which is the indium gallium phosphide in blue here in that refractive index graph. And in this region here in red in the reflectivity, the oscillations are due to the whole optical cavity here in blue and green. So this will be the top and middle subcell at the same time. So first of all, doing the Fourier transform of the middle subcell region, you get this graph here with a single peak, which is what we would expect. We have a single peak due to the top subcell only. So we now have an estimation of the thickness of the top subcell here, which is very good. Now we do the Fourier transform of the reflectivity in the red region here, and now we are starting to see multiple peaks. This peak here is a reminiscent of the actual top subcell, so we will not use it because we already know that value. But these two peaks are due to two different optical cavities in the cell, and these are actually due to either the top and middle cell or top, middle, and back surface field of the cell. So now we have three thicknesses that we can use in our simulation afterwards. And then if we use these thicknesses and feed that back into the reflectivity, we see that we can compare the experimental and the simulated results of the reflectivity. These match relatively well in the oscillating part. So the period of the oscillations are matched to a very perfect extent, which means that our estimation was good. However, on the other part, the amplitude is very different, and this is due to multiple factors. One is because not all of the actual layers are implemented in the structure, and as we saw before, this changes drastically the amplitude as well. And another one is the experimental has actually a full width at half max of 5 nanometer, which is non-negligible, especially in this range here. But we can still say that we got good reproduction of the reflectivity. So to conclude quickly, describe the cells that we are actually trying to measure in our lab and why we want to measure the thicknesses inside these cells. I presented the Fourier transform of the reflectivity as a reliable way to measure the semiconductor thicknesses. And then I showed that it was actually possible and relatively easy to do those measurements and to estimate the thicknesses. So we are now underway to measure multiple other cells and multiple other thicknesses that will give us very interesting results. So I would like to acknowledge all of the person who allowed these cells to be created and measured, and the funding agencies that allowed this work to be made. Thank you.